When Microsoft's MS-DOS was chosen to be the OS for IBM's new personal computer, their path was set to become the biggest software company in the world. How did they get this deal? In 1980, IBM was about to build a personal computer and needed an operating system. In my previous videos, we saw that the negotiations between Digital Research and IBM failed, and that IBM had chosen Microsoft to be the software developer for their OS. But why didn't they decide to go with CP/M, which was the popular system at the time? How did the negotiations fail? A lot of people asked questions. Time to dig deeper. But first of all, I need to introduce you to some people, products and companies. CP/M, the Control Program Monitor, later Control Program for Microcomputers, has been the standard operating system of the time. It was created in 1974 and produced by company Digital Research. Gary Kildall was the founder and CEO of Digital Research. Seattle Computer Products, or SCP, was a hardware manufacturer who developed hardware cards. Those hardware cards were able to extend the hardware of computers so that they could run additional software. Today you would maybe compare this product to running an emulator on your PC. Tim Patterson was an employee of SCP, the Seattle Computer Products. Intel was and is a CPU manufacturer and had two prominent processor models at the time: the 8-bit 8080 and the 16-bit 8086. Microsoft was and is a software developer, and Bill Gates was the founder and CEO of Microsoft. Paul Allen was the co-founder of Microsoft. IBM, the International Business Machines Corporation, was an extremely big company which was willing to create a business computer. In the late 1970s, home computers started to become famous, but only 10% of small business companies were owning a computer at all. The idea of a business computer was very young, and companies like Atari, Apple, Commodore and Tandy each had a decent market share without a clear winner. Other manufacturers had bigger market shares in their home markets in Europe and Asia. All the numerous computer models were basically incompatible with each other. The software of one computer wasn't running on the other, which was extremely frustrating for the users and especially for potential business customers. Apple, which had a decently big market share at the time, forced all products that were compatible with the Apple computer to carry the name Apple. So there was only one printer available for the Apple II, and it had to carry the name Apple on it. This printer was not manufactured by Apple, but it was sold by Apple. IBM had a big sales network and a whole lot of business customers. So it seemed to be a good idea to be selling computers to those customers. If they allowed other manufacturers to create compatible products for the new IBM PC, IBM would be able to set the standards of the industry and create a totally new market. So in July 1980, the IBM Corporation decided to create a new business computer. Since product development was generally a very slow process at IBM, they decided to found a small delegation, an IBU, Independent Business Unit, with a few people who then had to independently complete the task of creating a new computer within 12 months. This computer was supposed to consist of already existing parts that needed to be bought from other companies or come from inside IBM. Microsoft at the same time was and is still a software developer. They created some programs, especially the basic interpreter for already existing computers. Since the Apple II was one of the popular computers at the time, Microsoft wanted to find a way to run their software on this machine. Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, had the idea to create a hardware card with its own processor for the Apple II mainboard. Microsoft then assigned Tim Patterson from SCP, Seattle Computer Products, to create such a card. The card came with a Z80 processor and ran CP/M. Gary Kildall from Digital Research licensed CP/M for $25,000 to Microsoft. This means that Microsoft had acquired the right to sell CP/M alongside their hardware card, which they bought from SCP. So now Apple II users had the ability to buy a card from Microsoft and run CP/M with all existing Microsoft programs on their Apple II. This allowed Microsoft to sell its products to Apple users. While Microsoft expected a total demand of 5,000 cards, the product turned out to be way more successful than that. Microsoft was not the only customer of Tim Patterson's company SCP. He, Patterson, wanted to create a hardware card containing the fast Intel 8086 processor. For that card, Tim Patterson needed an operating system. So he went to Gary Kildall, Digital Research, and asked for a CP/M for the 8086. Since most money was being made with the actual hardware like the 8-bit 8080 Intel processor and not some future-like hardware like the 8086, Gary Kildall didn't put a very high priority on the development for the 8086 CP/M. Even though he said that he would be able to deliver in late 1979, Tim Patterson was still waiting for his OS in April 1980. So Tim Patterson decided to create his own operating system for the 8086. That was not as complicated as it may sound. Intel had a manual for translating commands for the 8-bit 8080 processor to those for the 16-bit 8086. Also, Tim took the manual of CP/M, which explained the functions of CP/M. With this information, Tim Patterson was able to rebuild most of the functions used in CP/M. Some functions were created by Tim Patterson himself. He never needed to see the code of CP/M, but that's a different story. Tim Patterson called his new operating system scp-dos, for Quick and Dirty Operating System. Later, it was decided to officially sell Tim Patterson's OS as scp-dos or 86-dos alongside with the SCP hardware cards. But now let's get into the real interesting part of the story, IBM's search for an operating system. IBM was interested in CP/M for their new IBM PC. CP/M needed to be modified to run on the planned 16-bit processor architecture. And in July 1980, IBM went to Gary Kildall to talk about buying his OS and the modifications that had to be made on it. They also went to Microsoft in order to buy their basic interpreter. How those talks went and what exactly happened is something we can't exactly figure out today, but there are different versions. So according to IBM, the IBM team went to the West Coast in order to talk to Gary Kildall and Bill Gates. Digital Research should deliver the OS, while Microsoft was supposed to deliver its basic interpreter. As the IBM team arrived at Digital Research, Gary Kildall was on a trip with his private airplane. Therefore, the IBM team had to talk to Gary Kildall's wife, who was in charge over the administrative management at the time, a lawyer and a senior staff member. The IBM team wanted to have an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, to be signed, which means nobody is allowed to talk to anyone else about the whole conversation. The IBM NDA was very one-sided. IBM was allowed to talk about a whole lot, while the other party, in this case Digital Research, could have been sued by IBM if anything about the talks would become public. Seemingly, IBM has been sued before when other parties claimed that IBM had gained a financial advantage created by conversations like this. Gary Kildall's wife decided not to sign the NDA. So it wasn't possible to start negotiations at all. IBM likes to tell the story that an employee of Digital Research claimed it wasn't even possible at all to modify CP/M to run on 16-bit, which is very weird, since how did they talk about this without being able to talk at all? Anyways, a short time later, the IBM team went to Microsoft in order to talk about buying the BASIC interpreter. Bill Gates instantly met with IBM and signed the NDA without asking any further questions. They had a friendly but sketchy conversation. IBM didn't tell Bill Gates exactly in which product they were actually interested. So that's the IBM version. Now, according to Gary Kildall, so here's the Gary Kildall version, Gary Kildall, admitted that he was late on a business trip and therefore couldn't meet with IBM for the original talk that failed after all. A short time after the first talk between his wife and IBM failed, Gary Kildall then met again with IBM. IBM offered him $250,000 in order to buy a modified version of CP/M from him. Gary Kildall declined this offer. He could sell CP/M licenses for $10 each, but he wouldn't completely sell the product with the single license. So that's the Gary Kildall version, and Bill Gates tells it a little differently. Bill Gates says that IBM came to Bill Gates first and asked to buy CP/M from Microsoft. Bill Gates then had to explain that CP/M was a product from Digital Research and not from Microsoft. But after the previously told fiasco had happened, IBM then came back to Microsoft to ask for a solution. That's the way Bill Gates tells it. So, after all, we don't know which of those versions is exactly true, but we can say that IBM was able to build a good business relationship with Microsoft, while the communication with Digital Research turned out to be problematic. The IBM delegation was impressed with BASIC and Microsoft, but had no solution for the operating system. So IBM decided in late summer 1980 to buy BASIC from Microsoft and not to work together with Digital Research. In order to find an operating system, another IBM delegation now went to Microsoft again and told that they were creating a new kind of computer in a short time frame and that Microsoft was supposed to create a BASIC interpreter for it. IBM insisted on a very short development time, gave no guarantees that the project would actually go public, and wanted to be able to always cancel the project without any payments or further obligations. Therefore, Microsoft had the big risk to put a whole lot of time and money into development and maybe get nothing after all. But Microsoft agreed anyways. After the talks were almost done, IBM asked if Microsoft could also help with creating an OS. While this might have been a shocking moment for all the Microsoft employees in the room, Bill Gates offered IBM to work a few weeks and then be able to show up with something. Since SCP was creating hardware cards for Microsoft, Bill Gates knew that they had operating systems to run on those hardware cards and also on 16-bit hardware. In September 1980, Paul Allen from Microsoft then went to SCP, the guys with the scp-dos or scp-dos or 86-dos for the 8086 hardware card and asked if Microsoft could get a non-exclusive license of the software. Because of the existing business relationship, nobody at SCP was surprised about that request, and 86-dos was sold to Microsoft. Also, Microsoft already had a license for CP/M that they would run on hardware cards, so there was really absolutely no reason to be suspicious. Since it was a non-exclusive license, SCP would still be able to continue selling their 86-dos on their hardware cards. Microsoft paid $25,000 for the license. Then Microsoft met again with IBM in October 1980 and showed them their freshly bought OS. In November 1980, IBM and Microsoft agreed that Microsoft would also deliver the operating system for the new PC. Microsoft then put in the work to modify the 86-dos to work properly and according to IBM's wishes on their PC. Since Microsoft was also working on BASIC and other programming language interpreters for the IBM PC, they did put a lot of work and effort into the whole IBM PC project. IBM still was able to cancel the project at any time and not to buy the product from Microsoft if they didn't like it. Because of that big risk, I can imagine that Bill Gates had some sleepless nights in those times. Paul Allen again went to SCP and asked for an exclusive license of scp-dos. SCP and Microsoft agreed that SCP would sell its DOS to Microsoft for a total of $50,000. The contract included a term that SCP would get 86-dos licensed back from Microsoft so that they could still sell their hardware cards. So at first sight, SCP could continue to make money with their DOS and still get 50 grand from Microsoft. Sounds like a great deal, right? The deal was made in July 1981, 1 month before the release of the IBM PC. After the work was done, IBM was impressed with Microsoft's product and wanted to buy it. Microsoft offered a non-exclusive license for the usage of the now called MS-DOS to IBM. Bill Gates argued that it was an important point in the success story of the computer that other manufacturers could use the same operating system on their machines. Only if there was a standard operating system that would run on every machine, software developers would create most of their programs for only this OS. Therefore, it would be the best if Microsoft could also sell their operating system to others. This would be the only real way to set a standard. IBM agreed, and Microsoft could sell its DOS to IBM and also to other customers. Microsoft created MS-DOS for the open market and PC-DOS for IBM, and made lots of money throughout the 80s and later. In 1983, my book called Microsoft's DOS the standard operating system of the time. Also, the IBM PC was a big success in its first years. The open architecture allowed many manufacturers and software developers to produce for this computer, which secured the success of the PC but also opened the market for IBM's competition. Anyways, that's a different story. Patterson left SCP in April 1981 and worked for Microsoft from May 1981 to April 1982. After a brief second stint with SCP, Patterson started his own company, Falcon Technology or Falcon Systems, which he later sold to Microsoft. Okay, so that's the biggest part of the story, but here still some notes, something to consider. All the information given in the last minutes came from my research. Since I wasn't present, there's a decent chance that some of the information I gave you is absolutely wrong. Some of the information is told from the perspective of certain individuals and may or may not exactly be true anyways. Especially the view of Gary Kildall seems to be extremely underrepresented. He died in 1994 after a head injury, and there are a very few sources where his version of the story is represented. Of course, we can't change the history, but we can learn about it. Did I miss something? Is there something you know better? Does Gary Kildall or Tim Patterson deserve the fame for DOS? Was this the deal of his life for Bill Gates, and was it brave to put a lot of money and resources into the development and of BASIC and DOS only for IBM, who had the right to pull the plug at any time without paying for the work done so far? Let me know in the comments and tell me what you think. Also, let me know what else you wish to hear from me about Microsoft, IBM and the PC in the 80s. And remember one important thing: whatever I told you in the story, don't believe in everything. I might have been wrong. Thank you for watching and God bless you.